You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mott,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is... Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast and a special event for the Storycraft Cafe. Today, I am super excited to have Suzanne Park back on the show. She has a brand new book that's coming out next week when we're recording this. When you're hearing this, it'll either be out today or tomorrow. It comes out Tuesday, October 4th. So however that works out for you and your time zone. The Christmas Clash. What a fun book. Suzanne, how have you been?
I've been great. Things have been going a lot better now that I guess businesses are opening and school's back in session and things are running more smoothly now, a year later since we've spoken. And thanks for having me again. I love this podcast.
You're so welcome. Last year when we talked, we had hope for the future, but we weren't quite sure yet how everything was going to go. So I'm super glad to be sitting at the place where we are now than we were a year ago. Sure.
Yes, in fact, I'm having my first LA based in-person event. I've never had my own book release event where I live. And it's kind of funny that 2.5 years later, after I debuted, that I'm actually having my first event where, I can invite friends and family that are local.
That is amazing. There's something to be said for getting to go out on book tour or, making the podcast rounds and stuff like that. And that's all wonderful and we love it. But there is something special about getting to invite people that have, kind of followed you all along or, been in real life and getting to see what you do. That's a great feeling.
It is. And my parents are actually going to be there, which could be a good or bad thing. I haven't decided. I explained to my in-person conversation partner that they would be there. Probably knowing them in the front row. So this should be interesting at the very least, because I don't think they've seen me speak in front of an audience in quite a long time. So that'll be fun for them too.
Oh, that's going to be so fun. So speaking of your parents, what was your household like growing up? Were you guys a bookish family? Well, how did books kind of play into your family life?
We didn't really have many books in our house. I remember when my parents recently moved closer to us for retirement, and we've been in the same house forever in Tennessee. And part of that move was getting rid of all of our childhood stuff and figuring out what would go with them and what would be donated. And we did find books that were in the house. There was a lot of circa 1980, maybe, Encyclopedia Britannica books, which are very in high demand now, I'm sure. We found those, and then we had a few Star Wars books that were movie tie-ins, and that's all we really found. So I think when it comes to books and growing up, I think I do know that I spent a lot of time in the public library system both in our neighborhood library, but also when I was in school, in high school, it was more of a metropolitan area. And I spent a lot of time in that library in the Nashville Downtown Public Library. So most of my reading and I guess checking out books and being able to consume books all took place in libraries.
And I think we talked about this last time, the fact that you did grow up in Nashville. Nashville is known, kind of as a music mecca for a lot of um, for a lot of different genres of music. We think, kind of immediately as country music coming from Nashville, but really all sorts of music. Nashville is a hub for that, and there's a whole industry built around the music business, music production, performing, but also writing. It is that something that casual citizens of Nashville get to get to see going on? Do you see the kind of emphasis that's on songwriting and kind of that mode of storytelling, just being a citizen of Nashville?
I do think that there is influence on people who grow up there. When I looking back to my high school days, I remember a lot of kids being interested in theater and music and songwriting and that sort of thing because it was a school that emphasized the arts. And and now there are also people that we knew that were close to our family that were adjacent to the music industry, not necessarily singers and songwriters themselves, but they worked in production and things. So it's hard to not be somewhat influenced by it, just as somebody that just lives there. But if you ask anybody that grew up there, they have a very strong opinion on whether they like country music. They either love it or hate it, or if it's in between, it's very rare. Like, you'll get a firm opinion because I think when you leave Nashville, people always ask you that, do you love country music? And I think when I was younger, I did enjoy kind of the old school country music, like the Loretta Lynn, Dolly Parton. And it's not until recently that you hear more of the mainstream country music, even kind of coming into the pop world, and it's changed so much. And I had this new appreciation for sort of the direction that country music has gone over the past few years.
You started your career as a stand-up comic. Did kind of living in a city that was very performance-based, did that factor into your love of comedy at all?
I would say that when I performed comedy, it really was after I graduated and when I was living in New York that it really became something that I thought was possible, only because I didn't know that there were comedy clubs in Nashville. It had seen them around when I was in New York, and it sort of all kind of fell into place. That's something that's accessible and something I can do. When I did go back to Nashville, I did realize that there was a comedy club that was had been there for a long time, and I actually reached out to them, and they let me perform a few sets when I come back for the holidays. And it was just nice to actually just be. It wasn't something I had to try out for or anything. I kind of had established myself enough in New York for them to just let me on the show, and I was able to invite my friends from Nashville to just come and see me, and that was just nice because it felt like I was doing this whole production, but it was with my friends and family, and it was just a nice, like, warmer environment because there was a lot of support around me.
Does your time in stand-up, does that bleed over into your writing career?
I think that the stand-up experience that I had definitely bled over into my career in writing. Usually, when I try to think of a book idea, I have to decide if it's a scene premise or actually a big enough idea to carry over into a novel. And usually, it's based on something comedic or something high stakes that only a character in a comedic situation could run into. So typically, something goes wrong and then more things go wrong. And because of the way that I had learned the craft of writing storytelling on stage, writing jokes and telling short anecdotes with a funny punchline, that really comes into play when it comes to not only just like efficiency of words and beats and timing, but it's also just how to create a scene so that you have this sort of nervous anticipation of what's about to happen, and then kind of not just take it to where people expect, but kind of push it farther and higher. Uh, so it's hopefully surprising and delighting people, but also kind of like, oh no, she went there with that.
When you're developing a stand-up routine and you start thinking of a premise, and then I'm not a stand-up comic, but I'm completely guessing here, but I would think that you come up with a premise and then think, how can I kind of spin this premise around so that people, I come up with something that they're not expecting, and it kind of takes them off guard, and that's, kind of the fun of it. And I would think that I would kind of relate that to maybe short storytelling. There's kind of one main kind of emphasis that I'm going for here, and then think of maybe a whole stand-up special as a journey through these different premises and things that you're taking the audience through, and maybe that's more akin to novel writing, where it's a longer journey, and maybe there's callbacks to all through the novel. Does that equate at all like that, or am I just completely reading more into it than I should?
I think you are onto something there. It really is hard to do a long comedy set, I have to say, and just as hard as it is to write a novel. 60 minutes on stage is generally like the minimum to be a headliner, for example. I was building up to that, and I got as far as creating like 60 minutes of solid material. And I have to say, just performing it and refining it and making it seem seamless, weaving the stories together, or the jokes together, has a very similar quality to writing a novel. Um, but when it comes down to writing your jokes and coming up with premises, most of mine were based on anecdotes or funny things that seem kind of like observational humor, and something. Again, I like to present something unexpected at the end. I would almost say that just the perspective of the comic, and the way they tell the story and the things they reveal, has a strong parallel to characterization when you're creating a character and how they view the world and their point of view, and what kind of voice they have. And so, like one of my jokes that I thought was one of my most, I guess, one of my favorite jokes, I would say, is one that I think usually people are surprised at the end. It was about how I had taken up running when I was living in New York. And so, you say, oh, I just started some exercise routines. Like I started running and people clap, right? Because that's like, you were polite, hooray for you. And then, I explained that a lot of people are worried about the safety issue because I like to run at night. That also sets up certain expectations. And then I say, well, I like to run at night with like a black t-shirt, black running pants, black running shoes, and a black ski mask. And people are still worried about my safety. And so, because it's sort of that thing where you expect something out of the person telling the story, and it takes it a whole different place. I love doing that in my novels too. And I think the joke craft really helped me figure out how to kind of take something and really enhance the characterization in all of my novels of just, the way they see life, and certain kind of things that might seem mundane and ordinary to somebody might be completely taken differently by the main character.
Well, one of the best things about novels is picking up a novel, seeing the cover, reading the blurb, thinking that that what this story is going to be about. Okay, I see what Suzanne's setting up for here. I know I trust her as a storyteller. This is gonna end up in a certain way, but I'm really excited to see how Suzanne takes me there. And then when you close the back cover of that book, you're like, oh, I never saw that coming. That's where did I just go in this story? That is the best part. So kind of subverting expectations is one of the best parts about being a writer, I think.
I agree. And, the back cover copy can only contain so many words and characters. And so sometimes when people read my book, they think it's one thing, and then when they finish it, they usually have things that they were not expecting at all from the back cover copy. One of the things going into the Christmas Clash, for example, is I really wanted to talk about something I've never had in any of my novels, is the idea of family secrets. I literally went in there going, I've never written a book about family secrets. I don't want it to be like a mystery, but I do like the idea of having families hide information from their kids. And I really went in there thinking, how am I going to incorporate that into this book? That might not be something, for example, that would make it onto the back cover, or it might not even be something that is mentioned very often in the reviews and such. But I really thought that was something that I wanted to try as an author. I think I was pretty successful in incorporating that kind of organically into the story, and it be something I haven't tried, but also kind of changes, where you think the story is going, and then reveal something about the family that even the characters didn't know.
Yeah. And the challenge is to get a reader on the hook with that back cover copy, like you're talking about, but to take how do I say this? Like you want there to be surprises in the Christmas Clash, for instance, since we're talking about the new book. And you want people to go on a journey they didn't expect to go on. But when you sell a book like the Christmas Clash, you don't expect to see Terminator robots, show up in the second act somewhere. So there's
Yes.
there's the balance of subverting expectations while also staying within the confines that the reader expects. And sometimes that's a tightrope that is hard to walk.
Yes, I completely agree, especially when there is a book. Actually, just in general, I like to write stories that blend genres. And so my debut YA, The Perfect Escape, was probably, I would categorize it as an adventure comedy with romance. And, there's no real space for that on the Barnes and Noble bookshelf. Like, here are all the books that are like this. And so usually people like to have things fall into one, the confines of a category. And when I don't fully write within the lines, it becomes a little bit hard to figure out how to, position the book, and then what type of readers would be most likely to have an affinity for this kind of book. One of the people who blurred my book, one of the authors, she said that, my book is like a modern day Romeo and Juliet, but a comedy without the death and tragedy. And I'm like, well, that's a pretty good description of this book. But I don't think that that's something that, would go on the front cover of a book, but it is exactly the right tone, and like the humor around even that type of blurb is really reflective of this book. So it is hard, I think, for publishers and authors to figure out how to best explain what this book, the book is, in a summary where you could get all the nuance. And so I think the Christmas Clash overall, you could call it definitely a holiday rom-com, but there are definitely layers in there that will be different than your typical holiday rom-com.
I want to come back to the Christmas Clash in just a minute, because there's some specific things about this new book that I want to ask you about. But before we do, we were talking before we started recording that you're at a writers' conference right now, and I was telling you that we're just starting this writing challenge with Dabble, that the first draft of a novel in 60 days is basically the premise, to go from having an idea to a plot for the new book, and then to write a first draft and to kind of bang that out. And we've got a big group of participants that have signed up, and we're kind of going on this journey together, and we're doing weekly podcasts about it. And there's something magical that happens when you get a group of people that decide to be creative together, even if it's not a shared writing experience. Like I'm sure there are probably some people that are maybe co-writing, but a lot of times we won't specifically know what each other are writing, but just being part of a group that's doing something like this together. There's a certain kind of magic that happens with that. Being at an in-person writers conference that you are, what kind of things does that feed the writer soul? Getting to attend in-person events and bouncing ideas off of people, and what does that do for a writer that just being in a solitary writing office can't give you?
I love being around other writers and authors. I think it's very important especially when you're starting out, to be around other people who are excited and enthusiastic about writing. One of the I'm at a writers retreat of people who I met at a writers conference, and when we all met 5 years ago at this writers conference, some of us are published and some of us are unpublished, but we ended up kind of finding each other. And there at that specific writers conference, there were speakers and there were breakout sessions, and I guess talks, sort of small groups focused on craft. But in the end, when you left the conference, there wasn't actually a lot of writing time. And that was always something that was kind of interesting to come out of a conference for writing and then not actually have written very much. It was just something that I noted. And then I went back the next year and the same thing happened again. So the purpose of this writing retreat, where we just grabbed 3 or 4 people, it rented an Airbnb in the middle of Arizona, and thought, if we're not near anything interesting, and we decide that we're all just going to sit here and write, maybe we'll actually get more of the writing done. And we're also at a part of our careers where I think certain craft subjects might not be as important now as they were 5 years ago when we were first starting out. So I think a lot of it is finding the right fit for what type of thing you're looking for. What the Writers Conference did when I first started out, what it did was help me just meet other writers and actually learn how to meet other writers. And then I was able to find a few really good friends from that conference who have stayed friends. And now, we do check-ins, we do Zoom check-ins, but it was just nice to finally meet in person after we hadn't seen each other since before the pandemic. And as I'm in this podcast, like, they're all in separate areas of the Airbnb, and they're all working on different things. And it's pretty quiet out there from what I can tell. There's a little bit of typing and a lot of scribbling. And I think people are really kind of heads down getting to work. So I think what we try to create here is work. So that was nice. It was an experiment. And there's snacks on the table, of course, plenty of water. So there's no problem there. So we'll be fine, fed. And now it's just a matter of just trying to get words on paper or on the screen.
Do you have opportunities at the end of the day where you kind of share things that you've worked on, or maybe problems that you're up against, or is it just kind of the knowing that you're all in the trenches together?
So far, organically, it's come up where every 30 minutes or so, somebody just talks out loud a problem they're fixing. And it works because we kind of need those breaks anyway. I like to stand up and walk around, for example, and other people are just sort of, during their breaks, just, getting a glass of water or grabbing something to eat. The problems that I just recently faced, I'm working on final edits for the book that's coming out in April. And I asked really loudly as I opened up the PDF, I said, what's a dangling participle again? I have to fix something. And somebody who's way better at grammar was just able to quickly tell me. And I explained what my the sentence structure was. They gave some ideas and I said, thanks. And then I was done with that. So it's funny because it could go as simple as that, something very specific and line edit specific, to another friend is sort of working on trying to figure out whether she needs to switch genres completely as an author, and some of the things that she's kind of dealing with from writing from scratch, like a new outline and a new synopsis in a genre she hasn't written. She'll occasionally ask questions too from other people within the group who do write in that genre. So far it's been a process of like us just sort of talking out loud. But we did say that maybe at the end of the day today, we can workshop something that we've written. I don't know if that will stick, but because I think 2 out of the 4 of us are on the shyer side and haven't done that before. I personally I don't know about the reading out loud, but I have a writers group who are not just novel writers. They write plays and they write short web episodes, and they read my work and have strong feelings about them. So I get my work critiqued at least monthly, and so I'm used to sort of that sort of shopping. But 2 others are not. So we'll see if that is something we try. At the very least, though, it looks like we're actually writing. So that's, again, the main goal of this trip.
Love it. Are you a hardcore planner? You mentioned outlines and synopsis earlier, and I know a lot of times the publisher will kind of want to have an idea of what you're working on next, and that forces you to kind of think through stories ahead of time. But when you get down to the nitty gritty of writing, are you working from a plan and outline, or are you kind of letting it go more organically?
I would describe my process as sort of a signpost documenter, meaning like not quite a pantser, not quite a plotter. And some people combine them as plantser and plotster. I don't think I'm still either of those. What I do try to do, at the very least, before I start something, is have the main pitch, the idea, the whole like summary of the elevator pitch, and then along the way, I know I need an inciting incident. I need to make sure that the midpoint the midpoint section is not muddy and boring. I know that I need a climax, a dark moment, and a conclusion. And so if I know what those are, I can at least start writing words. And I think if you think about it, that's less daunting, I think, than a full actually writing a synopsis. I find, even though I have those things kind of sorted out sometimes, I find writing the synopsis itself like homework, or writing a 5-page or a 5-paragraph essay back in high school, which would always just like give me heart palpitations. So I prefer to kind of just know where that's going. And then each book is different, though. So I think one of my earlier books, I found a notebook that I had dedicated to this book, and it was almost like a flow chart where I had a main plot and I had a subplot, and then some character development, and I just wrote little arrows on like a that I would write, and kind of where they were going toward the end of the story. And it was just, I had my main signposts, but then also underneath it I had like this interesting flow diagram that I've never done for any other book, but it was just showing the direction of their arc, both the story arc and also the character arc. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Maybe I'll try to do that again, but I have never done that again.
I like that idea of the flow chart as of kind of allowing you to visualize the kind of how the scenes are going to work together and parts of the story flow into each other. That's a great idea.
It is, and it really worked for that book. I was kind of tangled up in not having the story move forward, and I mean, there's a lot of people in the craft world who say that each scene needs to move the story along for a reason. And right. I was always just writing scenes either just to write jokes or just, hey, this is a funny thing that happens, just to write words down. And then when I realized it wasn't making the story flow, and maybe that's why I wrote arrows, I would end up having to delete scenes. And that was one that it was, it worked for that particular book, because I wanted it to be a fast moving book.
The Christmas Clash, your new book that's either, when people are hearing this, either releasing today or tomorrow, however that works for you and the reality you're living in. The Christmas Clash, what was the the initial thought when you started thinking about a holiday rom-com?
It was it was something that the publisher had asked if I would ever consider writing. And so it was already something that I was thinking like, oh, that would be something that's different. And I do like to do something different for each book. And I couldn't help but to tie a mall experience with the holidays, because I do see that done sometimes. But for teenagers to work in a mall and it to be a mall themed book, I thought that would be a lot of fun to write. Around the same time that I was thinking of this concept, I decided to look up my local childhood mall from one of the suburbs out in Nashville, and I found out that the mall was closing because it just couldn't find a buyer. And that made me really sad. So then I decided, let me write this book as an homage to this mall, and then I can, document some of the stories. And a lot of the absurd things that happened in the book are things that were inspired by something that actually did happen to me at that local mall. So that was kind of fun to like get that documented, write it down, make it funny. And at the end of me once I turned in the book, I found out that a regional developer had actually bought the mall. And so that was a nice kind of happy ending anyway for me, because I was kind of sad that I was writing this book to kind of document what this mall meant to me. And then it ended up being that it was saved too. And so that was nice to have as kind of what happened as the fate of this mall too.
Boring family-owned restaurants in a mall food court is a hilarious premise. How did you come up with that idea? It was so funny and at the same time completely believable. Like I could totally see how this works out. What a great premise.
Thank you. I got the idea from first of all, my parents' friends owned a restaurant that was not at a mall, but just I had to go there every week. I think my parents like to eat there and also like to chat with the parents. And it was a lot of I got to see sort of the behind the scenes of running this restaurant. And this family had other competing restaurants around them, and just the trash talking they did, and sort of the like they felt everything was so personal, and it was a lot of these things were just business. And so I really remember thinking one day I will write about this, even though my parents didn't actually run a restaurant. I did know a lot about that, and my parents did own businesses, so I know how like a small business is run. And then on top of that, just the idea that these two teenagers also work in seasonal businesses at that same mall. One, Chloe Kwon, she's a Santa's photographer elf, and Peter Lee is working at their virtual reality North Pole experience, and it's like very high tech. And it was also sort of putting them at war with each other because they have these warring businesses as well. And on top of that, at school, they're always kind of held up to be compared to one another. And so it was just like multiple layers of rivalry that was a lot of fun to write, because it was, deeply ingrained within the family just by having two restaurants that have always been competing. And then on top of that, just having their own competition as well. It just made this book very fun and easier to write than other books.
Tropes are something that we talk about, and all genres have their tropes. But when you're talking about romance, especially, tropes are very very prominent, and there are certain types of stories that people just love. And if you say this is an enemies to lovers story, people have certain very real expectations about that book. Or if you say this is a holiday rom-com, they expect certain things. When you are planning out your story and you know that these are enemies, so to speak, in the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
and you know that they have to end up at a certain place, when you're kind of in your planning of the story, are you looking for opportunities to put roadblocks in front of these characters that will things that will drive them together, things that will allow them to let their guard down and maybe to see things that are different than their assumptions. Is that part of the planning, like looking for ways that you could kind of intersect these people's lives that would drive them together?
Yes and no. I think a lot of authors actually do go in there and say, I want to write an enemies to lovers story, or I want to write a second chance romance, and go into the story knowing that that's how they'll craft it. And then there are some formulaic things you can do, or beats you can follow, and story structure that a lot of stories do follow. For my stories, I try to make sure that the way things unfold in somebody's life would happen sort of in an organic, funny way, but also be more realistic than maybe would be typical of a typical romance. So, for example, this story, I think there's times that they look like they're going to get along, and then things fall apart, and they then again look like they're going to get along again, and then things go awry as well. So that kind of, crashing into each other and then sort of separating, to me, that felt very organic and natural for teenagers. I know a lot of stories sort of build up the enemies in that they're enemies for until the very end of the book. And for some reason, that didn't really work too well with the way the story was unfolding, only because they do have to work together to save them all. And so they do have to get along to some degree, or at least fake it or force it. The part that I did know that I wanted to do was have a rivals to sweethearts scenario. So, is this an enemies to sweethearts, or is this rivals to sweethearts? I think the intention was for it to be rivals. Within rivalry, there's always some enemies component to it, but I would say it's closer to be rivals just because of the family structure, but also like how kind of the relationship starts out as childhood rivals. But for sure, they're also enemies at the very beginning. How holiday is also an interesting thing, because I think what I wanted to do was to incorporate the holiday season, not necessarily only Christmas. I know Christmas is in the story title, but I did want to capture that period of time that is between pumpkin spice latte season all the way up to the holidays, where it's just like all Christmas all the time. And it's several months long. And so I didn't want it to only focus on like just the, around, December 20 something. I did want it to be this, this longer stretch, because I do find it funny that as soon as like 4th of July goes down, all of a sudden pumpkin spice latte stuff comes up, and you're like, what's going on? When did this start? I don't understand. So I called it like the Christmas creep. And it's definitely a real thing where it's scorching hot outside, and yet people are told that they have to drink pumpkin drink. And it was just sort of giving a nod to that phenomenon that has happened in the recent past.
I blame Hallmark for playing Christmas movies in July. I think that's where it stems from.
That might be it, because it just really seems very unnatural and strange. But I believe that that's probably a Hallmark and a commercial push for sure.
Oh, for sure. For sure. The Christmas Clash is marketed as a YA holiday romance. When you're thinking in terms of your audience, are you thinking like, okay, this is a YA book, it's going to have to fit inside certain standards, or is it that the characters are teenagers, therefore the story is going to come out a certain way because it's from their viewpoint? What is it that makes a book YA? And I think that's a designation that trips up some people. They're not exactly sure what that means.
Honestly, some people have a little bit harder of a time to kind of flip between different age groups. And to me, it was a little bit more natural because I think I went in there knowing what I would change between an adult book and a young adult book. And that's specifically voice and perspective. When you look at voice of a character, it's, not just let's throw in some pop culture references and slang. It's definitely not that. It is really how kids in today's society act and behave. And I feel like whether it's because I had a marketing background and am very attuned to like what an audience and target markets are, how they behave, all the way to there's a lot of young adults in my extended family, and I'm around them quite a lot for holiday gatherings and just get-togethers, and I can just pick up and listen in and observe how a younger audience act and how they consume media and everything. I've found that, again, that really also ties into characterization with the voice. And so hopefully, and I have heard this from young adult readers that, I definitely have been able to connect to a lot of people. And in some cases, in my last book, Sunny Song Will Never Be Famous, I got a lovely message from a young adult reader who picked up the book because they liked the cover. They read the book and was surprised by it and actually learned a lot from it, so much that the book is about digital detox and a teen influencer who ends up getting sent to a farm for digital detox camp. And their devices off. There's no connection to the internet. And this young adult reader wrote me and said that she actually decided to put her phone down and try to do more things with her school. And she is now on the rugby team because of me. And when you hear stories like that, you're like, well, definitely this is something that even if it's not like the characters or the voice or anything specific, the message itself might be something that can be relatable to a young adult reader. I mentioned voice and also perspective. I also think that sometimes adults kind of, how do you say it, kind of use their all the knowledge they've gained and use that to write for a younger audience. And I don't know if that always resonates either, because there's definitely, the way a 14-year-old thinks is very different even than a 17 or 18-year-old thinks. And certainly with somebody that is writing a book that has, are full-fledged adults, they might try to incorporate some of their own knowledge and impart wisdom or whatever. And I don't know if that's always going to work with this audience. So it's, and to be honest, there's things that people just would do differently as a younger person versus somebody that's wiser and have more years under their belt and have learned a lot over time. I think young adults should be allowed to make mistakes and learn from them. And I, hope that a lot of the books that are written for young adults show this as a learning experience, and you allow that space to be able to do that.
And the great thing is that just because our protagonists are of a certain age, the rest of us get to enjoy these stories as well. That's the best part. Yes. For the Christmas Clash, just because of the type of mall I was writing, is like a mall trapped in time almost. There was definitely nostalgia aspect that I wanted to play up. And I think the adults that have read this book have really enjoyed kind of the nod to suburban mall culture that, that is something that been the younger generation, but also sort of, people who grew up kind of basically living at the mall. They appreciate the nods to some of the stores and the storefronts and the restaurants and that are still around today that, were, amusing even back then. So I think having that a bit of nostalgia for a mall book was something I put in intentionally. Love it. The Christmas Clash is going to be available everywhere October 4th. This is a must read, especially for this time of year. You're going to love it. Suzanne, we're going to put links to it in the show notes where people can grab it in Kindle edition or paperback or the audiobook. Have you gotten to listen to the audiobook yet?
I haven't listened to the final one. I have heard little tidbits, but I definitely want to listen to see how it all came together, because it's two actors for the different characters.
I'm anxious to see how that comes out as well. Go grab the Christmas Clash. Go visit your local bookstores and grab it there, or grab it from Amazon with the links that we'll provide. Suzanne, if people are just discovering you on this podcast and want to dig into all the great stuff that you're up to, where can they find you online?
They can find me at my newly revamped website, which I just finished up within the last month. It's
Nice.
SuzannePark.com. We have updated with all my latest, my newest books coming out. And then they can also find me on, most likely find me on Instagram at Suzanne Park. Twitter, I'm there sometimes. It's also Suzanne Park. And then Facebook, I'm occasionally there. And that is at Suzanne Park Comedy.
Excellent. We'll link up all that stuff to make it easy for folks to find you. Suzanne, this has been so much fun catching up. Thank you so much for taking time to come back on the show.
Thank you for having me. It was so much fun.